A few days later, the millionaire and her grandfather were both dying in the hospital because Christopher Lambert sat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table, his fingers steepled and his eyes like steel as they swept across the room. The boardroom's air was thick with tension, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city below. At 65, Christopher exuded the kind of authority that came with decades of relentless ambition. He was a man who had built empires from nothing, his name synonymous with power and precision. His bespoke suit, sharp and unyielding as the man himself, reflected the austere lighting, a mirror to his meticulously crafted image. "Gentlemen," Christopher began, his voice low and deliberate, commanding the attention of every executive in the room. "This acquisition is not just another deal. It's the cornerstone of our legacy. I expect nothing less than perfection." The executives nodded, scribbling notes, careful not to meet his gaze too long. Christopher's reputation was as formidable as his presence. He tolerated no excuses, no weakness. He leaned forward, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips, as if daring someone to challenge him. No one did, but as he gestured toward the projection screen to emphasize a point, a sharp, searing pain erupted at the base of his skull. His hand faltered, gripping the edge of the table. He blinked, the fluorescent lights above him suddenly glaring, the room tilting ever so slightly. "Mr. Lambert?" A voice broke through the fog, hesitant, unsure. Christopher tried to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. Sweat beaded on his brow as the pain intensified, a relentless drumbeat in his head. He felt his knees buckle as the room dissolved into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices overlapped in alarm, but Christopher's world narrowed to the crushing pressure in his skull and the cold rush of fear creeping into his chest. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, but Christopher couldn't discern who. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the polished surface of the table, reflecting his own crumpled form. The antiseptic scent of the hospital burned his nostrils as he stirred, the fluorescent lights casting harsh glares on white walls. His body felt heavy, his head a throbbing drumbeat of pain. A faint beeping punctuated the air, the rhythm steady, but ominous. "Mr. Lambert," a calm, measured voice interrupted his haze. A doctor stood at the foot of his bed, clipboard in hand, his expression carefully neutral. Christopher hated it. How practiced, how calculated it was. He'd mastered that look himself. "You experienced a rupture in your cerebral artery," the doctor began, his voice professional but softened by caution. "Aneurysm. We were able to stabilize you for now, but the situation is critical." Christopher's mouth felt dry, his voice rasping when he finally spoke. "And the solution?" The doctor hesitated, his pause speaking volumes. "Surgery is an option, but the risks are significant. A 2% survival rate. Without it, I'd estimate you have about a week." Christopher stared at the man, unblinking. The weight of those words didn't sink in right away. Instead, his mind latched onto the improbability, the insult of it all. Him, Christopher Lambert, untouchable, unstoppable, reduced to a number. 2%. He let out a low, humorless laugh, though it left his chest hollow. 2%. That's your idea of a solution? "It's the best we can offer," the doctor said gently. Christopher turned his head away, his gaze settling on the muted TV screen across the room. Stock market updates scrolled across the bottom, a language he understood, a world he controlled. Yet now, his body was the one market he could not manipulate. Denial swelled in him, hot and fierce. He'd survived boardroom betrayals, hostile takeovers, and even a recession that wiped out countless competitors. Surely this was just another hurdle, another negotiation, but the ache in his head told him otherwise. This wasn't a contract he could rewrite or a crisis he could overcome. This was final. As the hours dragged on, Christopher lay still, his mind unspooling memories he hadn't allowed himself to visit in years. Among them, Claire's face surfaced, her laughter as a child, the way her eyes lit up when he'd surprise her with gifts. Gifts, he realized now, had replaced his time and attention. She had grown distant, and he had let her. It had been easier to bury himself in work than confront her disappointment and her anger. Even now, he could picture her expression if she were here, a mixture of hurt and defiance, like a mirror reflecting his failures. His chest tightened, but it wasn't the aneurysm this time. It was guilt. Unresolved, festering guilt that he had shoved aside for decades. He closed his eyes, the beeping of the monitor echoing in his ears like a countdown. 7 days. 7 days to reflect, to regret, to reconcile. But with whom? Claire? Himself? The empire he had built at the expense of everything else? For the first time, Christopher didn't have an answer. The rain pattered against the windows of Christopher's limousine, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the weight of the doctor's words. His rambling thoughts caused his head to rest lightly against the cool glass as the city lights streaked by in blurriness, their once vibrant glow dulled. Mortality had never felt real before. Now it loomed over him, a silent, unwelcome passenger. "Go home yet, Mr. Lambert?" The driver, Garrett, asked cautiously, his eyes briefly meeting Christopher's in the rearview mirror. "Yes," Christopher replied, his voice curt, hollow. Only the rain could break the prolonged silence in the car. Christopher's gaze fell on a small figure huddled under the awning of a convenience store. A girl, no older than 10, was clutching a bundle of wilting flowers, her frame trembling beneath a threadbare coat. The scene jarred him. How could anyone endure such cold with so little? Christopher's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Compassion? Pity? He wasn't sure. "Stop the car," Christopher said, his tone sharper than intended. "Sir?" Samuel hesitated, confused but obedient, pulling over to the curb. Christopher stepped out, the chill biting through his tailored overcoat. He approached the girl slowly, his shoes splashing in shallow puddles. She didn't look up, her attention focused on arranging the flowers, her small hands trembling from the cold. "Why are you out here?" Christopher asked, his voice softened by genuine curiosity. The girl startled, her wide eyes darting to him. I'm selling flowers, mister," she stammered, her words punctuated by shaky breaths. "In weather like this?" Christopher's brows furrowed as he gestured to the relentless rain. She straightened, defiance flickering in her gaze. "They're for my grandpa. He's sick, and I need to buy his medicine." The simplicity of her words hit Christopher harder than he anticipated. She wasn't begging, nor was she asking for pity. She was surviving. He saw something in her then, a quiet determination that mirrored his own younger self, back when the world seemed equally unforgiving. "How much for all of them?" he asked, pulling a leather wallet from his coat pocket. The girl's jaw dropped slightly. "All of them. But they're not much, sir. Just $10. Christopher handed her a crisp $100 bill. "Take it," she blinked, staring at the money as if it might dissolve. "I don't have change. I don't want change." Christopher gestured for her to follow him. "Come, you're not staying out here any longer." The girl hesitated, clutching the money and flowers close to her chest. "But Grandpa, he's at home. I need to get back." "I'll take you," Christopher said firmly, motioning toward the limousine. His tone left no room for argument. The drive was silent at first, except for the occasional sniffle from the girl as she warmed her hands against the car's heated seats. Christopher watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she clutched the flowers as if they were lifelines. "What's your name?" he asked finally. Doris, she replied, her voice small but steady. What about you, mister? Christopher, he said, pausing before adding, Lambert. Her eyes widened slightly. Like the guy on TV? The one who owns all those big buildings? Christopher gave a faint nod, surprised she recognized him. Yes, that Lambert. Doris studied him for a moment, then looked down at the flowers in her lap. Why'd you stop? Most people just walk past. Christopher didn't answer immediately. He stared out the rain-streaked window, the weight of her question settling heavily in his chest. Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. The car slowed to a stop outside a rundown apartment building. Christopher stepped out first, holding the door open for Doris. She hesitated again before leading him to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Doris unlocked a door and pushed it open. Grandpa, I'm back, she called, but the room was eerily silent. Christopher stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The apartment was sparse, a single lamp casting long shadows across the cracked walls. In the corner, an older man lay slumped on a tattered couch, his face pale and gaunt. Grandpa! Doris's voice cracked as she rushed to his side, shaking his shoulder. Wake up! Christopher moved quickly, years of forgotten instinct propelling him. He kneeled beside the man, checking for a pulse. It was faint, erratic, but there. He needs help, Christopher said, standing abruptly. Garrett, call an ambulance! Doris looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Please don't let him die. Christopher met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I won't, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. As the rain continued to fall outside, Christopher felt an unfamiliar sense of purpose stir within him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about himself. The ambulance careened through the rain-soaked streets, its siren cutting through the night like a desperate plea. Christopher sat stiffly, his fingers gripping the edge of the gurney where Doris's grandfather lay motionless, his labored breaths barely audible beneath the cacophony of the vehicle. Doris clung to Christopher's arm, her small frame trembling with fear, but her tear-streaked face remained focused on Roger. He'll be okay, Christopher said, his voice low and steady, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The dull ache in his head had returned, creeping behind his temples with increasing ferocity. He ignored it, his attention fixed on the frail man before him. The hospital's fluorescent lights were blinding as the paramedics wheeled Roger inside. A doctor in scrubs rushed to meet them, barking orders to the staff. Christopher stayed behind, his breaths coming shallow as the weight of his own condition pressed on his chest. Mr. Lambert, a nurse called, her voice gentle but firm. You need to be examined. You're not looking well. I'm fine, Christopher snapped, though his trembling hands betrayed him. He turned to Doris, kneeling to meet her wide, frightened eyes. Stay here. I'll make sure they take care of him. Doris nodded, her lips trembling as she clutched his coat. Please don't let him die, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Christopher rose slowly, his knees weak, and followed the nurse down the hallway. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his senses as she guided him into a small room. Moments later, a doctor entered, holding a clipboard and wearing the same concerned expression Christopher had seen too often in the past few days. Mr. Lambert, the doctor began, we've reviewed your condition from the paramedics' report. Your aneurysm is worsening. We need to act soon. I don't have time for that, Christopher said curtly, gesturing toward the direction where Roger had been taken. What about him? The man they brought in with me. The doctor hesitated. He's in critical condition. Immediate surgery could save him, but we'll need consent for the procedure. Christopher's chest tightened. The pain in his head throbbed violently, but he waved it off. Do whatever it takes. Just save him." The doctor nodded, but lingered. "Mr. Lambert, you need to understand. Your own condition is deteriorating. If you delay treatment—" "I know what you're going to say," Christopher interrupted, his voice rising. He steadied himself against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his gaze was sharp, unyielding. "You don't need my consent for me. Focus on him." "Are you certain?" the doctor asked carefully. Christopher hesitated, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Every instinct screamed at him to prioritize his survival. He was Christopher Lambert. His empire, his legacy, his life wasn't meant to end like this. But then he thought of Doris, her trembling hands holding wilted flowers in the rain, her unwavering plea for her grandfather, a man who had clearly given her everything, even when he had nothing. "Yes," Christopher said finally, the word heavy with resignation. "Save him." The paperwork felt cold in his hands. The pen hovered above the signature line as he stared at the words before him. His name, his consent, would seal the decision. For a moment, the room blurred, and all he could see was Claire's face, her disappointed eyes, her unspoken anger. He'd failed her so many times. Would she ever forgive him if this was the last thing he did? He signed. The doctor took the form and left with a quiet nod. Christopher leaned back in the chair, his vision dimming momentarily. The pain in his head flared, white-hot and relentless. He clutched his temples, fighting the urge to cry out. "Mr. Lambert!" Doris's voice cut through the haze. She ran into the room, her small hands gripping his sleeve. "What's happening? Are they helping, Grandpa?" Christopher forced himself to sit upright, summoning the last vestiges of his composure. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but kind. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "They're doing everything they can." Doris's lip quivered and tears welled in her eyes. "But what about you? You look sick too." Christopher managed a faint smile, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Don't worry about me, Doris. Your grandfather is what matters right now." She threw her arms around him, her sobs muffled against his coat. Christopher froze for a moment, unused to such unfiltered emotion, before awkwardly patting her back. "You're so brave," Doris said, her words muffled. Christopher's throat tightened. Brave? No, he thought. He wasn't brave. He was just a man trying to atone for a lifetime of misplaced priorities. Christopher lay in bed, resting from the excruciating pain. The pale, sterile light of the room cast long shadows across the walls, and the persistent hum of machines underscored the quiet. He stared at the ceiling, willing his thoughts to settle, but they churned relentlessly, a mixture of exhaustion, frustration, and resignation. Garrett, his longtime driver, stood by the door, his cap in his hands. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. "You don't have to hover," Christopher said, his voice raspier than usual. "I'm not dying. Yet." Christopher closed his eyes, the weight of those words pressing on his chest. He had always prided himself on control of his business, his life, and everything in between. Now, lying here under the watchful eye of monitors and nurses, control felt like a distant memory. Samuel couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He stepped outside the room, pulling his phone from his pocket. After scrolling through his contacts, he tapped Claire's name. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice came through, brisk but warm. "Garrett, what's going on? Is everything okay?" Samuel hesitated, his free hand fidgeting with the brim of his cap. "Miss Claire, it's about your father." There was a pause on the other end. "What about him?" "He's in the hospital," Samuel said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "He collapsed earlier today. The doctors say he's stable, but they want to keep him under observation. Claire gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. Collapsed? What do you mean? Collapsed? Is he... He's stable for now, Samuel interrupted quickly, trying to reassure her. But the situation is serious. He hasn't told me much, but I thought you should know. Claire leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Distance and unspoken grievances had always strained her relationship with Christopher. But the thought of him in a hospital bed, fragile and vulnerable, was something she hadn't prepared for. Which hospital? She asked, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. St. Mary's, Samuel replied. Room 407. The antiseptic air of the hospital was thick with urgency, but Claire Lambert moved through it with a mix of determination and simmering frustration. Again, she thought bitterly. The man was as careless with his health as he had been with their relationship. She stepped into the bustling ER, scanning the room until she spotted him. He wasn't in his usual commanding posture, but slumped in a chair, his face pale and drawn. For a fleeting moment, a pang of worry pierced her anger, but she pushed it aside. "What's going on, Dad?" she asked, her voice clipped as she approached. Christopher looked up, the pain etched into his features softening when he saw her. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse, weak. "You didn't need to come." Her eyes narrowed. "Of course I did. You're in the hospital. Again. What is it this time? Overwork? Stress? Or something you decided wasn't worth telling me?" He didn't answer, his gaze drifting instead toward a small girl seated nearby. Claire followed his eyes to the child, clutching a bundle of flowers, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. "Who's she?" Claire asked, the irritation in her tone replaced by genuine curiosity. "This is Doris," Christopher said softly. "Her grandfather. He's in surgery. I brought them here." Claire blinked, her frustration momentarily forgotten. Her father had brought someone to the hospital, the man who avoided entanglements and emotional displays at all costs. Before she could press further, Doris stood, her small frame tense, but her eyes unwavering as she addressed Claire. "He saved my grandpa. He made the doctors help him first, even though he's sick too." Claire's breath caught. "What?" Christopher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's nothing," he muttered. "It needed to be done." Doris wasn't deterred. "It's not nothing. He said Grandpa was more important, even though the doctor said he needed help too." Claire stared at her father, her anger crumbling under the weight of the girl's words. You did that." Christopher didn't meet her eyes. The girl needed her grandfather. That's all. Claire's heart twisted, a maelstrom of emotions surging within her. This wasn't the Christopher Lambert she knew, the man who had spent her childhood chasing deals instead of moments, who had been absent more often than present after her mother's death. Yet here he was, prioritizing a stranger over himself. She turned to Doris, forcing a smile. "Thank you for telling me. Your grandfather is lucky to have you, and my father." The girl nodded solemnly before retreating to her seat, her hands still gripping the flowers as if they were her last tether to hope. Claire watched her for a moment before returning her focus to Christopher. "You should be in surgery too," she said quietly, her earlier frustration replaced by concern. "I'm fine," he replied, though his face betrayed the lie. "Let's not make this into something it isn't." Claire sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're impossible, you know that." Christopher let out a soft, weary chuckle. "I've been told." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Claire's mind drifted back to the years that had shaped this distance. She remembered birthdays celebrated without him, The empty seat at her school recitals, the quiet ache of her mother's funeral, when Christopher had buried himself in work rather than grief. "Do you ever think about Mom?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. "How she always wanted you to slow down, to be here." Christopher's expression flickered with pain, but he said nothing. Claire swallowed hard, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "You weren't there for us, Dad. You chose work over and over, and now you're throwing yourself away for strangers." Christopher closed his eyes, the weight of her accusations pressing down on him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was doing the right thing. For you. For us." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Well, you weren't, but you can still fix it." When Christopher didn't respond, she reached out, placing a hand over his. "Fight for your life, Dad. For once, don't run away. Stay. Stay for me." Christopher opened his eyes, meeting hers for the first time. The raw vulnerability in his gaze made her chest tighten. He nodded, a faint gesture, but it was enough. Claire stayed beside him long after his eyes closed, her hand still resting on his. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, for healing, for time, and for the father she'd always wanted him to be. The sterile white walls of the waiting room seemed to press closer with every passing second. Claire sat in the corner, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the doorway where her father lies resting. Doris sat nearby, her small figure dwarfed by the oversized hospital chair. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands, staring down at it as though it held the answers to all her unspoken fears. Claire glanced at the girl, her chest tightening. She saw herself in Doris, the vulnerability, the desperate hope for someone you loved to pull through. The difference was, Doris's devotion was met with action. She had watched Christopher sacrifice himself for her grandfather. Claire had spent years waiting for her father to show even a fraction of that selflessness for her. "How's your grandfather?" Claire asked softly, breaking the silence. Doris looked up, her wide eyes rimmed red. "The doctor said the surgery went okay, but he's still not awake yet." Claire nodded, unsure how to respond. Words of comfort felt hollow here, in this place where lives hung by a thread. "He's lucky to have you," she said finally. Doris shrugged, her gaze dropping to the tissue again. "It's just me and Grandpa. I have to take care of him. No one else will." The matter-of-fact tone made Claire pause. "You're too young to have to do all this on your own." "I don't mind," Doris said quickly, her voice firm. "Grandpa raised me when my mum left. He never complained, not once. It's my turn to help him." Claire's throat tightened. "That's a lot for someone your age." Doris hesitated, then looked up. "I'm used to it," she said quietly. "Grandpa gets sick a lot. I learned how to make soup, how to clean up after him when he's too weak. I don't even go to school much anymore because I have to be home to take care of him." The weight of Doris's words settled heavily in the room. Claire leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "You're incredibly strong. You know that?" Doris's face flushed slightly, but she didn't smile. "I just do what I have to." Claire wanted to say more, but the words caught in her throat. The quiet resilience in Doris's voice reminded her of the times she had wished for strength during her own lonely childhood. She thought of her mother's funeral, the ache of sitting in the front pew while Christopher stood in the back, speaking to clients on his phone. She thought of the empty birthdays, the awards ceremonies where her applause had only echoed back to her. "You and I aren't so different," Claire murmured, her voice almost to herself. Doris frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire looked up, forcing a faint smile. I know what it's like to feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. My dad, he's not the easiest person to love." Doris tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "But he saved Grandpa. He's a hero." Claire let out a dry laugh, more bitter than she intended. "He wasn't always. He used to think work was the most important thing in the world, more important than family." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Doris stared at her, her expression unreadable. "Do you think he's changed?" Claire hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. Bringing you and your grandfather here, risking himself like that. It's not the man I grew up with." Before Doris could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Lambert?" Claire stood immediately, her pulse quickening. "Yes?" "Your father has collapsed," the nurse said, her tone professional but tinged with urgency. "We're prepping him for surgery now. His condition is critical." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. "Can I see him?" "Just for a moment," the nurse replied. Claire turned to Doris. "Stay here. I'll come back as soon as I can." Doris nodded, her fingers twisting in the tissue as she watched Claire follow the nurse down the hall. The room where Christopher lay was dimly lit, the monitors around him beeping steadily. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Claire approached slowly, her footsteps muffled against the tiled floor. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking as she reached his bedside. "Why do you always have to push yourself until there's nothing left?" "You have to fight," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "Not for work, not for your legacy, for me, for us." The door opened softly, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Lambert, we need to take him now." Claire nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek as she released his hand. "Just bring him back to me." The doctor gave a nod, and the nurses began wheeling Christopher away. Claire stood frozen, her fists clenched as she watched the doors swing shut behind him. The ticking of the clock in the waiting room seemed to amplify with each passing second. Claire paced the narrow space, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow, making the sterile walls feel more oppressive. Doris sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, staring intently at the wilted flowers she still refused to let go of. Claire's mind reeled, her thoughts racing between the present and the past. She had promised herself she wouldn't let her emotions show, but the fear creeping into her chest was undeniable. The idea of losing Christopher, a man she had spent so long resenting, was too heavy to process. She paused, her hand brushing against the chair's cold metal armrest, and sank into it. Her gaze shifted to Doris, whose silence filled the room like an unspoken plea. "Claire." Doris's voice was quiet, almost timid. Claire forced a faint smile. "Yes. Do you think he'll be okay?" Doris's hands tightened around the flowers as her voice wavered. "My grandpa woke up after his surgery. I'm sure your dad will too." Claire swallowed hard. "I hope so, Doris," she said, though her words felt hollow. "He's stubborn. He'll fight." But would he? Claire's memories tugged at her, moments from her childhood, when Christopher had seemed invincible. She thought of the time when, as a little girl, she had been too scared to compete in her school's spelling bee. She had begged to stay home, terrified of making a mistake in front of the audience. "I'm not going, Dad," she had declared, tears streaming down her face. Christopher had knelt down, his hands resting on her trembling shoulders. "Claire," he'd said firmly but kindly, "you are the smartest kid I know, and even if you don't win, you'll show everyone how brave you are for trying. That's all that matters." His words had been enough to push her to the stage. She didn't win, but when she looked out into the crowd, Christopher had been there, clapping, his proud smile a beacon of reassurance. It had been one of the rare times she felt his undivided attention. Now, that same man was lying on an operating table, his life, in someone else's hands. Claire clenched her fists, tears stinging her eyes. "You can't leave, Dad," she whispered under her breath. "Not when I've just started to forgive you." Inside the operating room, tension mounted. Dr. Gentry frowned, his eyes scanning the vascular structures displayed on the screen above Christopher's head. The aneurysm was larger than anticipated, its fragile walls threatening to rupture with every passing second. "Suction," he ordered, his tone clipped. A nurse complied immediately, steadying the view. "Pressure is spiking," another voice announced. 140 and climbing. Dr. Gentry's jaw tightened. "We need to move faster." The team responded with synchronized urgency, their movements fluid but deliberate. Then it happened, a sudden burst of crimson on the screen, vivid and terrifying. "Rupture," a nurse called out, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Clamp it, now!" Dr. Gentry barked, his hands steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The monitors screamed, the once steady beeps morphing into frantic alarms. Blood pooled rapidly, obscuring their view. Dr. Gentry leaned closer, his focus narrowing to the thread of life he was trying to preserve. "We're losing him," someone murmured, panic creeping into their voice. "Not yet," Dr. Gentry snapped. His hands moved with almost mechanical precision, expertly navigating the delicate vessels. "I need the clip, now." The surgical assistant passed the tool into his waiting hand. Dr. Gentry worked quickly, securing the rupture before stepping back to assess the damage. The alarms began to quiet, the rhythm of Christopher's heartbeat returning to its fragile, uneven cadence. Dr. Gentry let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "Let's close him up." Back in the waiting room, Claire noticed Doris shivering despite the warmth of the hospital. Claire sat beside her, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You know," she began, her voice faltering, "I used to think my dad didn't care about anything but his work. But seeing him with you and your grandpa, it's like I'm meeting a different person." Doris nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the fabric of the blazer. "I think he cares a lot. He just doesn't always show it." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement." The doors to the waiting room swung open, and a nurse entered. Claire shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "How is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. The nurse's expression was cautious. "The surgery was successful, but Mr. Lambert is in critical condition. He's in a coma, and the next 48 hours will be crucial." Claire felt the ground sway beneath her. "Coma," she whispered. The nurse nodded. "He's stable for now, but his body is very weak. You can see him soon." Claire is trying to sound hopeful. "That's something." Doris nodded, but neither of them moved. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on them both. Claire reached for the girl's hand, holding it tightly as they sat together in silence. She stared at the door where her father had been taken and whispered, "Please come back to us, Dad. There's still so much left to say." Claire sat beside Christopher's bed, the rhythmic hum of machines filling the sterile air. Christopher looked impossibly fragile, his once imposing frame dwarfed by the hospital bed. His chest rose and fell with each assisted breath. The mechanical sound of the ventilator, a cruel reminder of how close he had come to slipping away. Across the room, Doris sat perched on a chair, her knees tucked beneath her chin. She clutched a small stuffed bear tightly, her wide eyes fixed on Christopher. The guilt on her face was unmistakable. "It's not your fault, Doris," Claire said softly, breaking the heavy silence. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. He made his own choices. He wanted to help. Doris shook her head, her voice cracking as she whispered, "If it wasn't for me, he wouldn't be like this. He wouldn't be so sick." Claire got up and crossed the room, kneeling beside Doris's chair. "Listen to me," she said firmly, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "My father is a stubborn man. If he decided to help you and your grandfather, there's nothing anyone could have done to stop him. He saw something in you, Doris. Something worth fighting for." Tears welled in Doris's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "But he could have died." Claire sighed, her gaze drifting back to Christopher. "He could have, but he didn't. And now we have to believe that he's strong enough to come back." Later that afternoon, the faintest groan stirred from across the room. Claire turned toward the sound, her heart racing. Roger, pale but conscious, was blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. Doris jumped up, running to his side. "Grandpa," she cried, her voice breaking with relief. "Your grandfather's right," Claire said quietly. "What my dad did. It's not the man I thought I knew." Doris looked up at her, her tear-streaked face etched with determination. "He didn't just save Grandpa. He helped me too. He made me feel like I wasn't alone." Claire's chest tightened. She thought of the years she had spent feeling exactly that, alone. Even in the moments when Christopher had tried to connect, his work always came first. But now, seeing him through Doris's eyes, she realized there were depths to him she had never explored. As the evening stretched on, Claire found herself back at Christopher's bedside. Doris had fallen asleep in a chair near her grandfather, her small body curled under a hospital blanket. The room was quiet now, save for the steady beeping of the monitors. Claire leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from Christopher's forehead. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Roger called you a hero. Can you believe that?" She paused, her fingers grazing his hand. "I guess I can. You've always been larger than life to me, even when I was angry with you, even when I thought I hated you. But now, I see you, Dad. The real you." The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. "I don't want to lose you, Dad. Not now. So you have to fight. Do you hear me? You have to fight, just like you always told me to." Claire squeezed his hand gently, her head bowing as silent tears fell. If you're feeling emotional and hoping that Christopher will wake up, leave a comment saying "flowers" so we can feel your love for the character and the story as a whole. Now, let's continue listening. She sat there for what felt like hours, the stillness of the room wrapping around her like a shroud. And then, the faintest movement, a slight pressure against her palm. Claire's head shot up, her eyes widening. Christopher's fingers twitched, the faintest sign of life breaking through the stillness. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Dad, can you hear me?" The monitors remained steady, and his hand fell still again, but the flicker of hope had ignited something in her chest. She reached for the call button, her pulse racing. "He moved," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "You're still in there." Claire sat back, her hand still resting over his, her resolve solidifying. Christopher wasn't gone. Not yet. And she would be there, every step of the way, waiting for him to come back. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital blinds, casting long golden streaks across the floor. Claire stirred in her chair, her neck stiff from another sleepless night beside her father's bed. The rhythmic hum of the monitors filled the room, a comforting reminder of Christopher's fragile hold on life. Her eyes fluttered open as she glanced at him. His stillness was unnerving, but she refused to believe it meant surrender. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. Doris peeked in, clutching her stuffed bear, and followed by Roger, who leaned heavily on a nurse for support. Despite his pale complexion, Roger's eyes held warmth. Claire stood and helped Roger to a chair near Christopher's bed. "Thank you for bringing him," she said quietly to the nurse, who nodded and left the room. Roger gazed at Christopher for a long moment, then spoke, his voice rough but steady. "You've got to wake up. You've done enough for me. Now it's your turn to fight." Claire's lips twitched, but she said nothing. Doris clambered onto the edge of the bed, her small fingers wrapping gently around Christopher's hand. "Mr. Lambert," she whispered, her voice trembling, "Grandpa says you're a hero. I think so too. But heroes don't just leave, okay? Please don't leave." The hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional shuffle of nurses or the quiet murmur of visitors in the hallway. Claire drifted between the room and the waiting area, fetching water for Roger or sitting in silence with Doris, whose faith never wavered. It was late afternoon when it happened. Claire had just returned to the room with fresh coffee for Roger when a low groan broke the monotony of the monitor's beeping. She froze, her gaze snapping to Christopher. His eyelids fluttered, his brow furrowing slightly. Claire rushed to his side, her hand instinctively grasping his. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "Can you hear me?" Christopher's eyes cracked open, their hazel depths clouded but searching. He tried to speak, but his voice caught dry and strained. Claire leaned forward, her hand brushing his cheek. "Don't try to talk," she said quickly. Just rest. You're okay." A flicker of recognition passed across his face, and a weak, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Claire," he croaked, the single syllable carrying a world of meaning. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, gripping his hand tighter. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here." Roger and Doris watched from the corner, their expressions a mixture of relief and awe. Doris moved closer, her stuffed bear clutched tightly. "See, Grandpa? I told you he'd wake up." Christopher's gaze shifted slowly toward her, his eyes softening. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered. Roger leaned forward, his voice filled with gratitude. "Don't push yourself, son. Just know that we're thankful. You gave me my life back. Now you need to focus on yours." Christopher's breath hitched, his chest rising unevenly. His eyes flickered back to Claire, and she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "Claire," he whispered again, the word rasping. "I'm sorry." She shook her head quickly, tears falling freely. "Don't. Not now. Just rest." But Christopher persisted, his weak grip tightening around her hand. "I failed you," he said, his voice cracking. "All those years. I thought I was doing the right thing. For you. For us. But I wasn't." Claire's heart twisted as she saw the tears gathering in his eyes. "Dad, it doesn't matter anymore." "It does," he insisted, his voice hoarse but determined. "I don't deserve this, any of it. But I swear, Claire, if I get through this, I'll be better. For you. For us." The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the machines. Claire leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against Christopher's. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "Together." Doris and Roger approached the bed, Doris's small hand brushing against Christopher's arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for saving Grandpa. You're my hero." Christopher's tired eyes met hers, and a faint smile broke through his exhaustion. "You're strong," he murmured. "Both of you." Roger placed a hand on Christopher's shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "Rest now. You've done enough." Christopher nodded faintly, his body sinking back into the bed. But this time, the heaviness was different, less like defeat and more like surrender to the care of those around him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft golden glow, Claire sat by his side, her hand never leaving him. A few days later, Christopher's recovery showed signs of improvement. He sat in a wheelchair by the hospital window, the pale light of morning warming his weathered face. His once commanding presence had softened. His sharp features were now marked with the weariness of a man who had fought for his life and barely survived. Claire adjusted the blanket, draped over his legs, her movements careful but steady. "You'll be back on your feet soon," she said, her voice calm but encouraging. Christopher chuckled weakly. "Don't rush me. I'm not as young as I used to be." Claire smirked, glancing out at the distant skyline. "You were never one for slowing down, Dad. Maybe this is the universe forcing you to." His smile faded slightly, and he nodded, his gaze drifting toward his hands, resting on the armrests. "I've been thinking about that," he murmured. "Maybe it's time I finally listen." The weeks following Christopher's awakening had been a blur of slow recovery and tentative conversations. For the first time in years, Claire found herself spending real time with her father, free from the usual tension that had defined their relationship. They talked about everything and nothing, her childhood, his regrets, even their favorite books. Bit by bit, the walls between them crumbled, revealing a connection neither had expected to find. One afternoon, as Christopher rested in his hospital bed, Doris and Roger visited. Doris ran to him with her usual exuberance, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "You're sitting up," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with delight. Christopher laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "I couldn't let you have all the fun, could I?" Roger leaned on his cane, his expression warm but serious. "You've done enough for us, Christopher. Now it's time for us to return the favor." Christopher shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. What I did." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the right thing to do. But it's still more than most would have done," Roger said firmly. "You gave me my life back, and I don't take that lightly." Doris hopped onto the chair beside Christopher's bed, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. "When you get better, can we visit again? Grandpa says we owe you forever." Christopher reached out, brushing her hair back gently. "You don't owe me anything, Doris, but I'd like that." As Christopher grew stronger, his mind turned toward the future. One crisp autumn afternoon, Christopher asked Claire to drive him somewhere. She agreed without question, though she was surprised when he directed her to a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. She followed him as he made his way slowly along the gravel path, leaning heavily on his cane. They stopped before a modest gravestone, its surface polished but simple. Claire's breath caught when she read the name etched into the stone. Rachel Lambert, her mother. Christopher stood silently for a moment, his shoulders trembling slightly. "I've failed her too," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Claire placed a hand on his arm. "Dad, you loved her." She knew that. He shook his head. "Not enough. Not the way I should have. But I'll make it right, Claire. For her. For you." He knelt carefully, his hand brushing the stone. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I've made so many mistakes, but I promise you, I'll do better. I'll honor your memory by being the man you always believed I could be." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she watched him, her heart swelling with both sorrow and pride. She kneeled beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We'll do it together, Dad," she said softly. She'd be proud of you. I'm proud of you. The two of them stayed there for a long time, the autumn wind carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of a new beginning. The morning light streamed into the Lambert living room, illuminating the room's warm hues. Christopher sat on the couch, a blanket draped over his knees. The air carried a sense of calm, but beneath it was an undercurrent of purpose. Claire entered with 2 steaming cups of coffee, setting one on the table before taking the seat across from her father. "You're getting stronger," she said, a note of encouragement in her voice as she handed him the cup. Christopher nodded, his hands steady as he took it. "One day at a time," he replied, his voice still carrying the gravelly edge of his recovery. He took a sip, savoring the warmth, before setting the cup down. "I've been thinking, Claire." Claire leaned back, raising an eyebrow. "That always means something big is coming." A faint smile tugged at Christopher's lips. "It is," he admitted. "But it's not the kind of big I used to chase. This time, I want to create something lasting, something meaningful." Claire tilted her head, intrigued. "Go on." Christopher's gaze grew distant, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. "When I look back at my life, I see all the things I missed, all the people I ignored in pursuit of success. But when I met Doris and Roger, I realized I've been doing it wrong. I had the resources to make a difference, but I didn't." Claire's expression softened. "You're trying now, Dad. That's what matters." Christopher nodded, his voice resolved. "I want to start a foundation, Claire. A charity that focuses on education and healthcare for kids like Doris, kids who deserve a fair shot at life." Claire's eyes widened. "A foundation? That's incredible. Have you thought about what it would look like?" Christopher leaned forward, his energy building. "I have. We could provide scholarships for underprivileged kids, partner with hospitals to fund treatments, and even set up community centers in areas that need them most. It's ambitious, but with the right team, I think we could make it happen." Claire smiled, her pride evident. "I think it's a brilliant idea, and it's exactly what you're meant to do now." Christopher paused, his eyes searching hers. "Will you help me?" Claire blinked, surprised. "Me?" "Yes, you," Christopher said firmly. "You've always had a heart for helping people, Claire. And you're sharp, smarter than I ever gave you credit for, though that's my failing, not yours. I need you by my side for this." Claire looked down, a smile tugging at her lips. "You really mean that?" Christopher reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I do. This isn't just about me making amends, Claire. It's about us building something together." She nodded, her grip tightening around his. "Then I'm in. But we're doing this the right way. No shortcuts. No cutting corners." Christopher chuckled. "I wouldn't dare. You'd never let me hear the end of it." Claire laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You're right about that." The two spent the rest of the morning discussing ideas. Claire jotted notes in a leather-bound notebook, her handwriting neat and purposeful. Christopher outlined his vision, his tone filled with a renewed sense of determination. "We'll name it the Lambert Foundation," Christopher said, his voice steady. "It needs to carry the weight of responsibility, a name that reminds us to do better." Claire nodded, scribbling the name at the top of the page. "And our first priority." "Doris's education," Christopher said without hesitation, "and ensuring Roger gets the care he needs." Claire smiled, her pen gliding across the paper. "Consider it done." As they worked, the room seemed to brighten, the air filled with a sense of possibility. The gentle hum of conversations filled the room as soft piano music played in the background. The Lambert estate, usually reserved for corporate dinners or grand receptions, had been transformed into an intimate gathering space. Christopher sat in his wheelchair at the head of the room, his once powerful presence now gentler, but no less commanding. Around him, familiar faces filled the space: Claire, Doris, Roger, and a small circle of friends and new collaborators who had come to celebrate this moment. Claire stood by his side, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Nervous?" she teased. Christopher smirked, the faint glimmer of his old self shining through. "I've spoken to shareholders worth billions, Claire. I think I can handle this." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "This isn't a boardroom, Dad. It's more important than that." Christopher nodded, his gaze drifting to the small stage set up at the front of the room. There was a podium with a banner that read, "The Lambert Foundation, a legacy of hope." The words had been chosen carefully, meant to reflect not just the man Christopher was, but the one he aspired to be. The quiet clinking of glasses signaled the start of the evening, and Claire leaned down, whispering, "It's time." Christopher wheeled himself toward the stage with Claire's help. As he positioned himself behind the podium, he looked out over the room, taking a moment to absorb the scene. Doris sat beside Roger, her face alight with excitement. Roger, though still frail, offered Christopher an encouraging nod. Claire stood slightly off to the side, her expression a mixture of pride and anticipation. Christopher cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his words slow but deliberate. "Thank you for being here tonight. I held the view that my company's size, acquisitions, and profits were all indicators of success for a very long time. I was wrong." The room fell silent, the audience hanging on his every word. "Success," Christopher continued, "isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you leave behind. And for too many years, I left nothing but distance. But life, as I've learned, has a way of offering second chances. This foundation represents mine." He gestured toward Doris and Roger, his voice softening. "A few months ago, I met a young girl selling flowers in the rain. That moment changed everything. It reminded me of the power of kindness, of connection, and of hope. This foundation is dedicated to children like Doris and families like Roger's, people who deserve opportunities, not obstacles." The room erupted into applause, and Christopher let the sound wash over him. As the noise settled, Doris stood and walked toward him, a single flower in her hand. She climbed the steps to the stage, her small frame dwarfed by the large podium. "This is for you, Mr. Lambert," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She handed him the flower, a simple daisy. "You changed my life. Thank you." Christopher took the flower, his hands shaking slightly. "No, Doris," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed mine." Claire stepped forward, placing a hand on Christopher's shoulder. "And you're just getting started," she said, her tone filled with warmth. The evening continued with laughter, stories, and plans for the future. Christopher watched it all from his seat, his heart full in a way he hadn't experienced in years. As the night wound down, Claire wheeled him to the terrace overlooking the sprawling garden. The moonlight bathed the space in silver, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Doris and Roger stood near the fountain, their laughter carrying on the cool night breeze. Christopher watched them, his chest swelling with pride and gratitude. "She's special," Christopher said softly, nodding toward Doris. Claire leaned on the railing beside him. "She reminds me of you, you know. Stubborn. Resilient." Christopher chuckled. "Let's hope she's more than that." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling into something warm and comforting. Finally, Christopher spoke, his voice low but resolve. "Thank you, Claire." "For what?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "For staying," he said simply, "for giving me a chance to fix what I broke." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening. "You didn't fix it, Dad. You rebuilt it. And it's stronger now." Christopher nodded, his gaze returning to Doris and Roger. "It's a good legacy, isn't it?" Claire reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's the best one." As the two of them watched the figures in the garden, the quiet hum of laughter and life surrounding them, Christopher felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. This wasn't the legacy he had imagined, but it was the one that mattered most. A legacy built on love, hope, and the courage to begin again. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining.